I hope you can hear me
Yeah,
now.
that's it, perfect.
Thank you for that introduction, Kai, and for your kind words about my book, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk, which is based on my book, which you've spoken about. But I think for people who've read it, there'll be other things in it too.
It's on my screen anyway.
Fantastic. Yeah. So I just think it's good to reflect on, you know, why one sets out on certain journeys in life, and you know, I wanted to say a little bit about my motivation for writing the book, because I actually started writing the book about 6 years ago in my work as, you know, I was working then as an NHS consultant psychiatrist and psychotherapist. And I was increasingly concerned by a feeling of offering psychotherapy to people in a bit of a vacuum. You know, that people seemed increasingly isolated. We lost our day hospitals and various day programs and so on. And with the rise of the internet, you know, it was very easy for people to be spending a lot of time on their laptops or their phones, often seeing very few people in the week and then coming to a therapy session. So that was one of my motivations about wanting to explore the benefits for mental health of a connection to nature, and particularly through gardening. The other was my own experiences in gardening, and I'm, you know, married to the garden designer Tom Stuart Smith, and together we've created a garden over the last 33 years. But at the beginning of that journey, I knew nothing about gardening. So the book also writes a bit about my own journey from a bit of a gardening skeptic to someone who really came to recognize how much it cleared my mind and calmed my mind. I was also sort of very, very troubled by, I suppose, things that we're all troubled by, most of us, I imagine, the planetary crisis, the climate crisis, and observing in my role as a psychiatrist how anxiety and depression seem to be on the rise, and really feeling that these two things, they're aspects of the same malaise, I think, which is not recognizing what people need to thrive or recognizing what the planet needs to thrive. So what we're talking about, I think, fundamentally is a devaluing of care or disregard of care. And one of the themes that sort of very, very quietly in the background is woven through the book is the idea of the metaphor that we use to think about the brain, because there's quite little bits of neuroscience in this book. And the most common metaphor that's used in neuroscience literature, both popular and otherwise, is that of the computer. And I feel that's a very insidious way to think about ourselves. It slips into our language. We begin to think of ourselves as a machine, or like a machine that can be fixed like a machine can be fixed or not, rather than part of nature, part of the natural world. And, you know, the mind, like plants, like a garden, needs to be cultivated, needs to be weeded and pruned, physically weeded and pruned, because there are cells in the brain called the brain's constant gardeners that actually do that. They're called the microglia cells, and they keep the brain healthy in a healthy state. So that just gives you a bit of an idea of some of the messages in the book. Now I wanted to start. Oh, I can't move the slides myself. Can you do the next one, please, Andrew? Yeah. So I wanted to start with this slide of the camasias that have just come into flower in our garden, and they appear in the book in a chapter about the origins of gardening. And because I really wanted to understand the roots of gardening. You know, gardens are so often, if you look at sort of historical accounts, it's like farming came first, you know, the Neolithic, the agricultural revolution, and then later people started gardening. And I really felt it must be the other way around. And I was very interested in what came before, and also in some of the indigenous forms of cultivation and gardening, which the colonialists kind of stumbled across in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is an example of that. So these camassia flowers, which are now, you know, in this country an ornamental garden flower, grow in the wild, and in the case that I'm talk about in the book, it was the explorer James Douglas who in 1843 stumbled on the shores of Vancouver Island in British Columbia and walked out into an amazingly beautiful meadow full of camassias in flower, full of butterflies, and dotted with ancient Garry oak trees. This is a rare oak. Now he wrote home that he had discovered an untouched Eden, and what he was looking for was the site for a new trading post for the Hudson's Bay Company, and the settlers, you know, did settle there, and they tried to turn many of these meadows into farmland, very unsuccessfully, in fact, because the ground and the climate wasn't really suitable. But what was it completely ignored, or they chose to ignore, was that this was the ancestral home of the Lekwungen tribe of the Coast Salish people. These people were fishermen and women, foragers, but also they cultivated these meadows. These meadows were sacred to them, and the bulb of the camassia was a delicacy. It also gave them a crucial form of starch over the winter. They would cook them very, very slowly. Apparently they taste like sweet chestnuts. But these families each had a plot within the meadows. So this was not an untouched Eden. This was a sacred space, and it was a cared for space. And I cite other examples in the book, which, you know, for example, the Maori Gardens, which were very much sacred gardens. The Maori came from Polynesia originally. They were experienced gardeners, and they worked out how to garden in the colder climate of New Zealand. But alongside each garden, there was a separate garden which was dedicated to the god Rongi, and that garden had the first plantings and the first harvestings in that were offered to the god. Also, the gardens of the Achua in the Amazon, again, which was a sacred spaces where, whilst the women work, they sing to the goddess Nunki, who is the goddess of cultivated plants. What I'm really trying to communicate here is that it's very easy to think of gardening, particularly these days, as a nice hobby, a bit of a luxury in one way, or the opposite, which is, you know, unnecessary toil, demeaning manual labour. Whereas actually throughout history, I think from our very early origins as a species, gardening and cultivating the soil has been imbued with deep existential meaning. Can we have the next slide, please? You know, and I think seeds. Okay, I'm going to talk about seeds. I think we glimpsed something of that at the very beginning of the pandemic, when there was such a rush on seeds, both here and in North America. The same phenomenon, and a connection to nature. You know, through gardens, people appreciating their gardens in a new way, but also appreciating walking in nature, parks, hiking, bird watching, you know, when people were allowed to get out. The solace that people found in nature when the human world was in such a state of upheaval and uncertainty was enormous. You know, there's something about the cycle of the seasons that was not affected, and that the cycles of growth and decay and so on became something to rely on. Even sunset and sunrise, I think, in a way, felt it took on a new resonance for people. it's one of the most powerful effects of gardening is linked to seeds, because when we sow a seed, we are automatically thinking 2 or 3 months ahead with a sense of positive anticipation. You know, whether that's for the flowers we're going to grow or the produce we're going to harvest, it gives us a sense of a future. And of course, that's what was invaluable at the beginning of the pandemic. It happened to be spring. Everybody's holidays were cancelled. Everybody's weddings were cancelled. So much of life was on hold. And there was a lot of fear and anxiety. But gardening was a way of shaping a little bit of people's worlds and giving them something to look forward to. And for me, sowing seeds is really what hooked me into gardening, and it's still the thing that I love most. That effect, if we could have the next slide, please. That effect of turning to nature at times of crisis has been called urgent biophilia by the socio-ecologist Keith Tidball, who's researched disaster zones, natural disaster zones, post-war, post-conflict zones, and really documented how regularly that people turn to nature in the aftermath when they need to rebuild their lives. That connection with nature helps them feel that it's possible for new growth to occur, for change to occur. So this is a slide of our vegetable garden at home. So some of those seeds that you saw in our greenhouse earlier were destined for here. And I just wanted to reflect a little bit on sort of how I garden, because this may not be what some people's idea of a vegetable garden is like. So you can see there are bean poles there, and the runner beans are just beginning to sort of climb up them. But there's an awful lot of self-seeded annual flowers in my garden, and you can see the poppies and the Ischoltz here and the verbena and so on. These are flowers that I first sowed 20 or 25 years ago, and I love sort of letting them come where they want to come, or where they, you know, I like letting them be. I like that sense of not being fully in control. Of course, they have also a very important role in terms of attracting pollinators. But fundamental for me is this feeling that gardening is about a to and fro relationship. That feeling of I do a little bit, then nature does a bit, and then I respond to that. And it's not all about the need to determine everything that's happening in the garden. And after all, when we're working with nature, that's not possible. Nature is so complex, and there are so many variables to contend with. But there have been times in the past when gardening, historically, and you know, up until recent times, when gardening really was like that, and parts of the world where it still is, where, you know, the immaculate lawn, which is soaking up lots of water, you know, is the epitome of an ideal garden, rather than a garden that you know, offers a habitat for other forms of life apart from ourselves. In other words, you know, gardening for wildlife. This is so important for us to grasp this change, I think, with the biodiversity crisis that we are really well into now, and there isn't time to say more on that, but it is the drop in the numbers of insects, for example, is extremely worrying. Can we have the next slide, please? So I want to introduce my grandfather, Ted May. He was one of the inspirations for writing this book. This photograph was taken in his 60s. He's in his greenhouse with the orchids that he loved growing, and he died in his early 70s when I was about 12. And I'd grown up hearing from my mother the story of how he had been captured as a prisoner of war in Turkey. He was a very young man, and had returned home at the end of the war, extremely malnourished, very traumatized, in a state in which my grandmother, who'd waited for him, didn't recognize him at all. And that it was eventually through a year of horticultural rehabilitation that his life was changed, was put on a new course and on a different course. And in the book, I wanted to set out, part of my research was trying to find where he did that, and it turned out to be a place called Sarasbury Court on the shores of the Hamble River in Southampton, a place that had an awful lot of glass houses. There were 10 glass houses there, and apart from a big vegetable garden and orchards and so on, he learnt to grow exotic plants there. And when I discovered that, it made sense to me of his love in later life, not only of his smallholding and his bees and his birds. He kept birds as well, but the exotic plants and particularly the orchids that he loved growing. Now, the First World War, in many ways, I mean, the scheme that Ted attended was one of many that was set up in sort of 1919, 1920, that kind of time, because there were so many men who were disabled and traumatized and unable to slot back into their lives in the way that they, that I think people had to some extent expected them to be able to do. So this is the birth of horticultural therapy. It wasn't called that then. It was very much seen as vocational training, but it was the first time it was rolled out on a large scale as a response to disaster, and actually it was also very important during the war. And I want to look at the next slide, which is a slide from the Imperial War Museum archive. This is one of quite a number of trench gardens that were documented during the First World War on the Western Front. This is the back wall of a trench right on the front line. And you can see, I hope you can see enough of the slide to see the sort of triangular shaped garden there, with the figure in the garden holding the spade was called Captain Irvine from the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. This was in the spring of 1915, so early in the war. He was killed 3 months later. These gardens were spontaneous. The soldiers wrote home asking for packets of seed, and their relatives sent them the kind of flower seeds that they would have been familiar with from home, kind of cottage garden kind of flower seeds. Brightly coloured, the things that grew quickly, nasturtiums and pinks and all sorts, really, morning glory, and they occurred on both sides of the lines. The German soldiers had the same response to the situation they were plunged into. These men were surrounded by the most unthinkable form of industrialized warfare, surrounded by death and destruction and having to manage fear as well as boredom, actually, because there were long periods of inaction. And the gardens really fulfilled a very important role, I think, and it's clear from the soldiers' letters, the extent to which it helped them, on the one hand, hold on to an alternative reality, but also gave them something creative to do in contrast to the sort of destructiveness in which they'd been plunged. Can we look at the next slide as well? Thank you. Just one more quickly from the First World War. This is later in the war. This is October 1917. This is a soldier from the Gordon Highlanders. And really what I just want to highlight here is the look of care and attention on his face. And I mentioned earlier about the devaluing of care that seems to be all around us in today's culture, or in much of today's culture. And one of the things that's very important about expressions of care in neurologically, in terms of our neurochemistry, is that it's very, very closely linked with our endorphin system, our natural opioid system. So, you know, of course, care can be very onerous and over demanding and exhausting and so on. But you know, the kind of care I'm talking about, manageable care, pleasurable care, much of what we get from it is about the feelings that come through activating the endorphin system. It brings with it a feeling of calm, a pleasure, a bit of a mood boost, you know, and with that come other things, you know, feelings of motivation and purpose and so on. And I think we're going to look at Bridewell next. So it sounds like some of you will be familiar with Bridewell. I hope. If you're not, I really recommend going to one of their open days. It's such a fantastic project and very beautiful to visit. This I wanted to show this aerial view because it gives a good idea of the structure and the layout of the garden, and you know, you can see here it's a large walled garden. And walled gardens are very valuable in terms of therapeutic gardening, because they provide such a strong sense of physical safety and protection. Sanctuary, really, is what we're talking about. So you're in an enclosed space, but you're not entrapped. You know, you're open to the skies, you've got views, you're not hemmed in, but you feel held and protected. And that's enormously important, particularly for people who are recovering from trauma and PTSD, who you know, one of the things they have to struggle with is constant need to be vigilant, to be sort of watching their backs, to be on alert. And entering a garden like this can help that subside. And really, until people reach that kind of state of relaxation, they can't really be open to new experiences. They can't open themselves up to change, as it were. You can also see different areas within it, and the thing I want to flag up here is the importance of both the doing aspect of gardening. So you can see there the raised beds, the vegetable beds, and the glass house and so on. So that's all about the sort of doing and the productivity, the physical activity of gardening, and the very sort of direct handling of plants and intimacy with plants. And then higher up at the top of the screen, you can see some small areas, slightly more formal areas, where people can go and sit and contemplate, be on their own, simply be with nature. So the other aspect of being in the garden is just simply being. It's not doing. If you like, a kind of more mindful state of being, but really connecting with nature through the body, through the senses, and being very much in the present moment. Could we have the next slide, please? This is another garden that features in the book, which I visited in Sweden. It's called Alnarp. It's actually a very, very interesting, and in terms of research into horticultural therapy, I think important place. It's located in the University of Agricultural Sciences. It's near Malmo, and it's been running for about 15 years. And this is just one corner of the garden. And as you can see, there's a pond, there's a large stone, there's a hammock. So rather like Bridewell, there are lots of productive areas. And then there are also these quiet areas where people can find refuge. And actually, at the beginning of this program, the participants are not allowed to do any gardening. The first 2 weeks of this program is all about people learning to slow down, and to sort of ground themselves and connect with nature. And that might mean sitting on the large stone or lying in the hammock or contemplating the water in the pond. And that's partly because the client group coming here are largely, not always, but suffering from burnout and depression, often through overwork, sometimes through trauma. Again, you know, they're also developing a program dealing with PTSD and refugees. But in all those cases, just that simple returning to the body and connecting with the natural world, and not being too busy, is a very important part of it. If we could move on. I'm just going to mention Sigmund Freud. He features quite a bit in the book, but because we haven't got much time, I'll keep it very brief. This is a photograph taken in what is now the garden of the Freud Museum in Hampstead. It's a garden that belongs to the house where Freud spent the last year of his life, having come to London as a refugee. It's not very well known that Freud was a great lover of nature, and in particular a great lover of flowers. And he'd always spent the summers in the mountains hiking and botanizing. He was something of an amateur botanist. But during the last 16 years of his life, when he was struggling with his health, he had a cancer of the mouth that necessitated removal of part of his jaw. And he suffered an awful lot of complications and pain from this. He wasn't allowed to travel anymore. He wasn't. His doctors forbade him, and the garden really became his solace, really. And he would walk around the garden every day. And you know, most of these gardens before he came to London were in Vienna. He would rent a villa on the outskirts of Vienna each summer for 4 or 5 months, and for him the only thing that mattered was that it had a large garden in which he could walk. Can we have the next slide? Because he also spent a lot of time in this garden bed which he had built for him in Vienna and brought with him when he escaped the Nazis. And when he was dying, his bed was brought downstairs so that he could continue to gaze out through the French windows at the garden and the flowers that he loved. And I think, along with many other people, you know, for Freud, the garden really helped him confronting his own mortality. And, you know, when we work with plants, or just spend time in nature, you know, we are simultaneously put in touch with the transience of life, with the ever changing nature of the cycle of life. But at the same time, we have a sense of the continuity of life, of the cycle of the seasons, and so on. So these two things, I think, being able to sort of experience both of them together is enormously helpful for people. And you know, it's a phenomenon that's been called symbolic survival. So that was coined by the psychiatrist Robert Lifton, who felt that really we can only face our mortality if we have a sense that something will survive. And that doesn't need to be through nature, but he felt that nature was one of the most commonly found experiences people describe. It can take many other forms, through creativity, through belief in the afterlife, through investment in children and so on. But we do have an existential need to feel that there's not complete obliteration of everything we've had and experienced. I want to just move on to think about beauty, actually, because beauty was something that was extremely important to Freud, and really sort of understand a bit further, a bit more about beauty and its effects on us, because I think beauty is a form of emotional nourishment, and it's easy to underestimate the power of that. Freud once commented that whilst beauty can't protect us from suffering, it can compensate for a great deal. And he also remarked on the sort of peculiarly intoxicating feeling that, you know, that sense of merger you can have with beauty, with gazing at something beautiful, can feel a little bit like an intoxication. Iris Murdoch, the philosopher, has described it as unselfing, that we come out of ourselves, we feel at one with the beautiful object, and in turn we are somewhat beautified by this experience we can take back in. So there's a very strong feeling of peacefulness and connectedness that comes through experiencing beauty. And what the neuroscience shows, and there's some very interesting fMRI scan studies that have been done on this by a neuroscientist called Semir Zeki, based at University College in London, is that experience of beauty, regardless of the medium through which we experience it, this is beauty across the board, including mathematical equations for mathematicians, beauty has a signature in the brain. So yes, we have the sensory input will show, but along with that, beauty activates the deep emotional centers of the brain in a way that Zeki likens to romantic love. So I think what we're talking about is reminding ourselves about our love of life. And I think this is one of the things that the beautiful flowers that the soldiers were growing in the trenches must have been doing for them, to hold on to that feeling of, yes, something is worth fighting for, and, you know, life can be beautiful. And you see, there are other examples of this, more contemporary ones, where the charity, the Lemon Tree Trust, which builds gardens in refugee camps, mainly in parts of the world around Syria and Iraq and so on. What they found when they started, and they were very surprised by this finding, was that 70% of the seeds that people requested to grow were flowers, although they desperately needed food. But their need for beauty was so strong. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is Donald Winicott, and he was a British pediatrician and psychoanalyst. His thinking influenced me quite a lot in my sort of explorations of the effects of gardening on us. He was quite a passionate gardener himself. I mean, unlike Freud loved gardens but didn't really get his hands dirty. Winicott certainly did. This is him on the roof terrace of his house in London. Winnicott wrote a lot about our need for creativity, both for children through play, imaginative play, but also in adult life, that living creatively, finding ways to live creatively was something that Winnicott felt was associated with a state of health. And gardening is a very accessible way to feel creative, to be creative. Yes, it can be a bit intimidating if you don't know anything about it, but once you start, you know, if you think about, you know, sowing some pumpkin seeds, for example, you know, or sunflower seeds, these little tiny seeds, all you have to do is, you know, water them, you know, take care of them, pop them on when they need to, be potted on, plant them out, and 3 or 4 months later, you've got this wonderful, wonderful large pumpkin or giant sunflower. And at some level, we can feel, gosh, I've done this, you know, and other people may say, wow, you know, you grew that. And that may sound a bit trivial, but this kind of effect came through very powerfully in for example, interviews that I carried out in prisons, for example, the sense of self-esteem that can come with that. Because really what we're doing is we're working with nature's creativity. It's a coming together of human creativity and nature's creativity. And that's the way I see gardening. And I think it's that coming together that makes it such a powerful therapeutic intervention. So I want to just move on to just think a little bit about hospitals and prisons, just to give you some slides, and we can probably in the discussion sort of touch on some of these a bit more. This is Horatio's garden at the Spinal Injuries Unit in Salisbury at the District General Hospital. It was the first garden created by the charity Horatio's Gardens, and there are now 6 gardens that they've completed, and they're hoping to create a garden in each of the 11 spinal injury units around the country. Now, what I want to highlight here is the idea of the garden as an in-between space. So you can see the hospital building in the background. What you can't see is the car park behind. But this was previously kind of neglected ground, as there often is in lots of places, you know, places where things have been dumped or stored, or, you know, it's just sort of ramshackle, often, you know, a kind of sort of neglected mess. So this garden is part of the hospital. So the patients feel completely safe there. The surfaces are all geared towards, they're very smooth. So there's no jolting for wheeling of beds and wheelchairs and so on. In fact, we could look at the next slide and you can see a patient lying out in the sun. So it's very much part of the hospital, but it is so not the hospital. You know, it's a complete escape from the clinical environment. And you know, because patients with spinal injuries are in hospital for so long, that is really crucial, and to have a space that is changing. You know, the clinical environment doesn't change much. In a garden, there's always a little bit of novelty. There's always something new to see, something coming into flower, perhaps some seed heads later in the year. There are insects, there are birds. People can feel very connected to life. And when you're in hospital, you feel totally separate from life. You're sort of taken out of the stream of life. And really, these gardens in these kind of situations are a lifeline. They help people hold on to their sense that they can return to life, and also help them hold on to their relationships, because these gardens are a really lovely place to receive visitors, to see friends, and so on. And everybody enjoys being in the garden. I think we'll just say a little bit about prisons quickly. So yeah, here we go. This is San Quentin Prison in California. It's a project called the Insight Gardening Program, which is now running. It started in San Quentin. It's now running in 8 prisons across California. And it was very contentious that the first garden that was made by this program was a rose garden. Because there was a sort of objection about why should prisoners have beauty. But, you know, if you reflect on some of the things I've been saying about beauty, I think there are many very strong arguments why to introduce beauty. And certainly Beth Wakekus, who set up this program, feels that through gardening, many of the prisoners she works with learn to understand what it means to care about others, to care about life, to care about the planet, because part of this program is very much about ecology as well. And what their research showed, if we could have a look at the next slide, which shows them creating some vegetable beds. What their follow-up research showed was that it was the prisoners who had taken on board this sort of the ecological messages that were a part of the curriculum here. It was those ones who had changed their lives the most as well. So as if these two things go hand in hand. It's about, I think, shifting towards a relationship of care, self-care, but care for others, and care for, you know, an attitude of care towards the planet. The reoffending rates for this project are very impressive, as they are also for the other project that I visited in America, which is very impressive, in New York, called Rikers Island. So the reoffending rate after 3 years for Rikers and for San Quentin the rate is 60%. So 60% of prisoners are back inside after that time. People who attend either of these programs, it's as low as 10 to 15%. So these programs make a real difference. And part of their strength is that they enable people to carry on gardening through internships and so on once they leave prison. And of course that really does help, you know, prevent people falling back into crime. Just a couple more slides to end on. I'm aware of time. So yeah, I just wanted to say a tiny bit about community gardening and urban gardening. This is the creation of a garden in the South Bronx. It's called the New Roots Refugee Project. It's run by the International Rescue Committee and the New York Botanical Garden. And let's have a look at how it looked the following year. We should be able to see it next. Yeah, so you can see it's very productive garden, all the raised beds and so on. Also the little market in the corner that brings people from the community into the garden, links people through food to each other. And I think what I want to highlight here is a finding that came out of a report into urban farms and community gardens that was carried out by the John Hopkins Centre for a Livable Future. And they looked at the instances of these kind of gardens in cities all across America. And they were looking for what kind of impact such gardens can have and what are the outcomes. And what they found was that the strongest outcome of all was strengthening of the community and relationships between people. And they, you know, yes, there were lots of other benefits in terms of health and diet and local food economy and so on, but a reduction in violence, you know, there were all sorts of other benefits. But across the board, they found that it was the social benefits that were the most powerful. And they coined a term which I really like, which is gardening as a social bridge. And I think if we go on to the next slide, we can see another example of gardening as a social bridge. So this is a garden run by the Chicago Botanic Garden in the south side of Chicago. It's a project for at-risk youth called the Windy City Youth Harvest. And this is all about, you know, the kids come here in the summer vacation, they come after school. Yes, they're learning to garden, and they sell the produce in the market to help fund the project. But it is all about learning to collaborate with each other, to communicate with each other. The garden gives them a safe space because the streets around here can be very unsafe. And it also provides a kind of learning environment, a place to learn about life, and to build self-esteem, because many of these kids have very, very low self-esteem. And as I mentioned earlier, through gardening, you can see what you've done. You can feel proud of it. You can share it. The pumpkin you've grown or you've helped grow, it can be made into soup that everybody shares. And that's really fundamental to how gardening works in this kind of situation. If we the slide I want to end on is a CGI of the project that I'm working on in terms of I suppose one of the outcomes of my book has really been developing this project with my husband Tom. It's in an orchard very near our own garden, and we've been working on it for a couple of years. This is how it will look eventually. The building is currently, it's a bit of a building site at the moment. The building is nearly finished, not quite. There's a nursery behind the building, which will be gardened by a charity we've been working with for quite a long time called Sunnyside Rural Trust, which works with young people and adults with learning disabilities of various forms. It's a wonderful charity. And they grew all the plants for Tom's Hampton Court Flower Show garden last year at their nursery in Hampstead. So we've also already set up on the left-hand side of the screen. You can see some vegetable plots there. They're up and running. And at the very beginning of the pandemic, we offered those to anybody who wanted to garden, who lived within walking distance. And there are 7 plots there now, one of which will be taken by our local youth counselling charity called Signpost, and the others are all gardened by families living in the hamlet around us. So this is very much work in progress. The thing that is also really getting off the ground now is that you can see on the right hand side of the screen, in the upper part of the screen, is the plant library, which my husband's design team have been establishing. It's a collection of plants where people will be able to come and see, I think at the moment there's 1,200 different varieties in there of plants, some of which are Mediterranean and some of which are woodland plants, because we've got different habitats within this site. So it's a learning resource. The point of this project is to provide a learning resource for schools, for mental health charities, but also for people who are just interested in horticulture and design. So it's across the board, really, the whole spectrum of gardening. So I think I'll end on that, because I think I might have run out of time.
So thank you so much. My goodness, and what a vision to be able to end with in terms of the future plans there. That sounds very exciting, and to be able to open those up for people. Look forward to seeing how that progresses.
Yes, it is very exciting. It's sort of becoming more real. We've been working on it for 2 years now. Yeah. So in fact, longer in the conception of it, 4 years in the conception of it.
Right. And so much seems to have come out of your book in so many ways. I'm sure you've been invited to many different lectures or giving seminars and so on. But I know, you don't have to read the back of your book for the Monty Dons and the Rachel de Thames and Stephen Freud but I think I know from others who've read it and have drawn on the well of your experience and insight, which you've conveyed to us today in a wonderful way. Thank you. I think rather than go into groups, actually, I have a sense that I think it'd be rather good just to see where we go in terms of questions.
Yeah, I'm quite happy with that.
That's all right.
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can talk. If you go into groups, I'll probably be sort of I mean, I could go make a cup of tea, of course, but you know, I'll have to go be out of it and then come back in. So I'm happy either way, whatever seems
Well,
to
I think we should. I think we should do that. And I think I mean, there's so many things that I've jotted down in my notebook. But you started by talking about the. I mean, if I start the questions, if that's all right, give myself the opportunity to do that. I mean, you talked initially, right, about recognizing what the planet needs to thrive, and gosh, we need so much, don't we? Need to know that, to realize it in these deeply anxiety-provoking times of wondering what is really going to happen, whether we are going to be able to make it in terms of environmental catastrophe that seems to be on the doorstep. We seem in so many ways, I wonder if we're in this kind of almost like a liminal place, a kind of a place that you talked about in between. And such places, as I understand it, is they're full of potential.
Yeah.
So the little seed that is placed in the soil has, I personally, when I was sowing my little tomato seeds, thinking, I still can't believe this tiny little pip going to produce.
It is,
I think it's wonderful. But how do we nurture that potential, that sense of in this in-between space whereby there is the beauty to be cherished, yes, but actually I'm not sure this is a question, but it's more an observation, but how do we kind of yes, nurture it, but actually recognize something and celebrate something that is also potentially dark and difficult and anxiety provoking and distressing and affects our souls deeply?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think what you're talking about is how, I think there's a sort of paradox, isn't there? Because if you're totally disconnected from nature and choose to turn a blind eye to what's going on, you don't have to manage the kind of feelings that you're talking about. So yeah, the more connected you feel to nature, the more you care about nature, the more pain you can feel about the state of things and what, we and our forebears, collectively, I mean, this is, this situation hasn't come overnight, has it? We look back through history, it's been, building up, and, the destruction of nature and habitats and so on. It's been going on for a long time. The pain of that can be very hard to manage, as you say, real darkness. And it now has various labels applied to it, sort of eco anxiety or environmental melancholia, climate grief, so on. I think one of the things I feel through gardening, and I think why I think it's very important to introduce children to gardening and encourage them and help them learn how plants work, how the cycle of life works, how the soil needs to be nourished, how composting works, and so on, is that whilst there are some things about our situation and the damage that's been done which are going to be very, very difficult to reverse, I think the polar ice caps have reached this kind of tipping point, but, as far as we understand. I mean, the idea they're going to stop melting is kind of probably not realistic, is it? But when it comes to biodiversity loss and the regeneration of soils, there's a huge amount we can do. And I think when you start gardening and you start working with nature, you realize how quickly, given the right conditions, the natural world will respond. So I think that can be very strengthening and hopeful. But there's no solution. There's no easy solution to the situation we're in. So I think gardening is very helpful in this context, and every little bit we can do to kind of, I was trying to highlight the sort of aesthetics of gardening, you know, by showing my vegetable garden, you know, in terms of, you know, not having sort of too much bare soil, not having sort of areas of monocrops, even within a garden, you know, you sometimes see that, you know, not using herbicides and pesticides and so on. You know, there's so much we can do. We you know, we're in the month of May now, No Mow May. That's a really important campaign, and can make such a difference to supporting insect populations and also providing beauty around us.
Thank you.